talk a little bit about how the final approval for the vaccines occurs before distribution?
Sure. So as we mentioned at the outset, sort of authorization or approval of therapeutics or vaccines in the United States are subject to approval, regulatory approval by the Food and Drug Administration. So all the science and the design of the trials that we just talked about are all part of that process in order to gather the evidence to allow the FDA to make a decision about whether a therapeutic or a vaccine is safe to be distributed in the broader population. And so that's the stage that we're sort of approaching right now. Ultimately, it will be the Food and Drug Administration that will give that approval. And what's being discussed really is that in these two particular candidates so far, again, the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna candidates, that they will be shortly applying for something called emergency use authorization, which is a specialized process that the FDA has set up for emergency situations like a pandemic. And I know, Will, you know a fair amount of that process. So maybe I'll let you talk about that. Suffice it to say, I think that the thing I would emphasize is, while this is meant to be for a really emergent situation and to speed up the process, it's not meant to in any way sacrifice the integrity of the science, whether that's related to the actual outcome of interest, preventing infection, or safety. But you want to talk a little bit more about the details of that EUA, Will?
Yeah, thanks. And I think you really hit it, that the scientific integrity of this process is actually virtually indistinguishable from the full licensure process. In fact, the FDA pre-published standards for what the emergency use would look like. And they said, we're not even going to license this vaccine if it's not at least 50% efficacious, which they haven't done that for prior emergency use authorizations. So a lot of great guardrails there. It still goes through a safety process. So we're still looking at a median of 2 months of safety event outcomes after people have received the vaccines. And then in terms of saving time to get it out faster, that's the purpose of the EUA without sacrificing any efficacy or safety. And the way they do that is, they're doing some manufacturing checks that would normally occur while it's being studied instead of afterwards. And they're not waiting for a very long period of safety data to accumulate, but rather a still meaningful but safe level of data to emerge. So yeah, essentially they're calling it an EUA plus. Because as I said, it's virtually indistinguishable from what you would see in a normal process. And the good news is here that the efficacy is coming back very high. The safety results are showing nothing serious and on par with other vaccines. And it's going to get the vaccine, out the door, save potentially 6 to 12 months and help curb this pandemic.
Yeah, and Will, one other thing I'd add, and again, you may have comments on, a lot of the public, of course, let's face it, we've been living in a very politicized environment in the United States as it pertains to the pandemic. And in some cases, a lot of distrust on vaccines more generally, as well as pharmaceutical companies and otherwise. And I think the thing that I would also emphasize is that part of this process is to have independence by those associated with the FDA or the EUA process, so that those with business interest, like Pfizer or Moderna, or those with political interest should not be involved in ultimately reviewing the data. The decision should really be made on the data that comes from the science, which comes from the trials. But those decision makers are supposed to be independent, and my understanding is that there's a independent panel associated with this EUA process, which ultimately will make those decisions.
Yes, that's exactly correct. And actually, again, this process doesn't really differ between emergency use and the normal process. So that committee is called the Vaccines and Related Biologic Products Advisory Committee. And as you noted, it's a group of independent experts and scientists who will make a formal recommendation on whether the vaccine should be authorized or approved, and they review all the data. And it's a public committee, so anyone can listen in to the meeting, and anyone can see all the documents that they have. So it's a very transparent and public process, which is great. And I would also add that the manufacturers actually released a statement that said that they would only support a process that that followed a public process and pre-approved standards, such as the FDA had published. So I think manufacturers also did their part in ensuring that this would be a transparent and pre-approved, scientific, effective, and safe process.
Great. One other thing I'd add about that public transparency too, and for those of us that are a little bit more data or science geeks, I actually sort of spent time in my class on Monday with my students looking at clinicaltrials.gov, which is where one can actually see the underlying study design, what we talked about in terms of the randomized control trial and the treatment and the placebo arms, and all the details about recruitment and everything that goes into that. So not only can you see the findings, as you just mentioned, but you can also see how the research is designed and set up. This event, sort of trial that you mentioned. So for anybody that's interested in those in the weeds details, that's all available publicly as well.
The only other thing I would add is just saying that I mentioned that there's a little bit of extra time for safety accumulation that's pushed off so that the vaccine can come out sooner. But I would add that what they call phase 4 trials will continue throughout the distribution process to monitor not only for additional safety data, but also just to see how long the effects of the vaccine are holding up within people. So there's a post-market surveillance phase, as they call it, to make sure that this stays safe and that its effectiveness holds.